How London Changed. Decade by Decade tells the story of a city that reinvented itself so completely that each generation inherited an unrecognisable world. In 1950, you could buy a Chelsea house for less than a second-hand car today, and the city was covered in actual soot. Yet here's the twist. Every decade brought such radical transformation that the London of the 1950s and today's metropolis might as well be different planets. And the journey between them is far stranger than you'd imagine. Think about this. London went from literal rubble in the 50s to the swinging capital of the world in the 60s, then straight into economic collapse in the 70s when rubbish piled 6 feet high in Leicester Square and the dead went unburied. The 80s were even more brutal. Thatcher's government demolished what remained of working-class London, deregulated the city, and turned Docklands from derelict wasteland into a financial powerhouse, while entire communities were crushed under the weight of unemployment and riots. Then came cool Britannia in the 90s, the Millennium Dome disaster, and the dot-com boom. The 2000s brought terrorism, the Olympics, and the financial crash. The 2010s saw Brexit tear the country apart while property prices reached levels of genuine insanity, with entire buildings owned by foreign investors sitting empty. And the 2020s? A pandemic ground everything to a halt, proving even London could stop. Each decade didn't just change the city, it obliterated what came before and built something entirely new on top. Let's dig into exactly how this happened. Decade by decade, the 1950s, London literally stank. While we romanticise post-war Britain's blitz spirit, the reality was absolute mess. Over 70,000 buildings had been completely destroyed during the war, and another 1.7 million were damaged to varying degrees. Entire East End neighbourhoods looked like someone had taken a giant hammer to them. But what most people don't realise is just how grimy the place was. The Great Smog of 1952, which killed an estimated 12,000 people over just 5 days, wasn't some freak occurrence. It was the culmination of millions of coal fires and industrial pollution. Visibility dropped to less than a foot. People literally couldn't see their own feet. Cattle in Smithfield markets suffocated. The social fabric was changing too. The Windrush generation began arriving in 1948, and by the 50s, Caribbean communities were establishing themselves in Brixton and Notting Hill. This wasn't smooth integration. There was genuine hostility, discrimination in housing and employment, and tensions that exploded into the Notting Hill race riots of 1958. Meanwhile, the Festival of Britain in 1951 tried desperately to show Britain still mattered. But architecturally, the decisions made in this decade would haunt the city for generations. Now, you might be thinking the 50s were all doom and gloom, but wait until you hear what happened when the 60s rolled around. That's when London went from bombed-out imperial relic to the absolute centre of the cultural universe. And the transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. The 1960s gave us the London everyone thinks they remember. This was Carnaby Street, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Mary Quant, and the miniskirt. King's Road became the epicentre of youth fashion. Time magazine declared London the swinging city in 1966, and for once, the hype wasn't entirely wrong. But here's what's often glossed over. While Twiggy was modelling and David Bailey was photographing everyone who mattered, London was bulldozing vast swathes of perfectly good Victorian housing and replacing it with some of the most aggressively ugly architecture ever conceived. The Euston Arch, a magnificent piece of Greek Revival architecture, was destroyed in 1962 despite massive protests. It was architectural vandalism that's still controversial today. Tower blocks sprouted everywhere. The idea was simple and seductive. Clear the slums, house people vertically, create streets in the sky, and build a modern utopia. Councils embraced it with almost religious fervour. Ronan Point, A 22-story tower block in Newham partially collapsed in 1968 after a gas explosion blew out load-bearing walls. 4 people died. The building had only been open 2 months. The Victoria Line opened in 1968, actually completed on time and under budget, a feat that seems impossible by today's standards. If the 60s were swinging, the 70s were stumbling. This was the decade London almost collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. Power cuts were routine. The 3-day week meant businesses literally couldn't operate normally. Rubbish piled up in the streets during strikes. Leicester Square once had waste stacked 6 feet high for weeks. The winter of discontent in 1978 to 79 saw the dead going unburied because gravediggers were on strike. London wasn't just unfashionable, it was barely functional. Economically, the city was hemorrhaging. Manufacturing industries that had employed hundreds of thousands were closing or moving out. The docks, which had been the lifeblood of East London for centuries, were dying. Containerisation meant ships needed deeper water and more space than the Thames could provide. Dock after dock closed, and with them went communities, jobs, and entire ways of life. By the end of the decade, the Docklands were derelict wastelands, and nobody had a clue what to do with them. Yet amid the chaos, something interesting happened. Punk exploded onto the scene in the mid-70s, and London was its birthplace. The Sex Pistols, The Clash, and a generation of angry young people created music that perfectly captured the city's decay and frustration. Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's shop on King's Road became ground zero for a movement that was simultaneously nihilistic and creative. This wasn't pretty rebellion like the 60s. This was raw, aggressive, and deliberately confrontational. The National Theatre finally opened on the South Bank in 1976, a brutalist masterpiece that people either loved or loathed. There was no middle ground. The Barbican Centre was taking shape, another brutalist project that would eventually become one of London's premier arts venues, though it wouldn't open until 1982. Architecturally, London was doubling down on concrete, and the results were, shall we say, divisive. Housing became increasingly desperate. Squatting was common, with entire streets in areas like Kentish Town and Notting Hill occupied by people who simply couldn't afford legitimate housing. Some squats became quasi-permanent communities with their own social structures. The authorities largely turned a blind eye because there was no realistic alternative. The 70s might sound like an absolute disaster, and in many ways it was, but what came next made those strikes and power cuts look quaint. The 80s were about to transform London more dramatically than any decade since the Blitz, but this time the bombs were metaphorical, and they were being dropped by Britain's own government. The 1980s didn't just change London, they created an entirely new version of it that would have been unrecognisable to anyone from previous decades. Margaret Thatcher's government looked at London and saw opportunity for radical transformation, and transform it they did with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. The Big Bang of 1986 deregulated financial services and turned the City of London into a global powerhouse overnight. Suddenly, London wasn't just competing with New York and Tokyo, it was beating them. American banks poured in, bringing American-style salaries and bonuses. Young traders in their 20s were earning more in a year than their parents had earned in a lifetime. The city went from bowler hats and gentlemen's clubs to braces, mobile phones the size of bricks, and a culture of aggressive capitalism that shocked traditional institutions. The flip side? Everywhere else got hollowed out. What remained of London's manufacturing base largely disappeared. The GLC, Greater London Council, was abolished in 1986 because Ken Livingstone's left-wing administration was an irritant to Thatcher. For 14 years, London had no citywide government, which sounds insane but was absolutely deliberate. The Docklands were handed to a development corporation with sweeping powers. Canary Wharf began its transformation from derelict wasteland to financial district. The first buildings went up, and Londoners watched skyscrapers rising where once ships had unloaded cargo. The Docklands Light Railway opened in 1987, a futuristic automated system that initially served almost nobody because the developments it was meant to connect hadn't been built yet. It was a bet on the future, and remarkably, it paid off. But the social cost was enormous. Council housing was sold off under right to buy, which was great for those who could afford it, but devastated the social housing stock for everyone else. Property values began their inexorable rise. Areas like Notting Hill, which had been rough and affordable, started gentrifying rapidly. The yuppie became a figure of both aspiration and hatred, depending on which side of the divide you stood. The riots of 1981 and 1985 showed how divided the city had become. Brixton erupted in 1981 after years of tension between police and black communities. Broadwater Farm in 1985 saw some of the worst rioting in London's history. A police officer was murdered, and for a few days parts of London felt genuinely lawless. These weren't just protests, they were explosions of rage at unemployment, discrimination, and heavy-handed policing. Yet culturally, London was thriving. The new romantic movement, bands like Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran, embodied the glamorous side of 80s excess. The Blitz Club became legendary. Fashion was bold, theatrical, and confident. London's club scene was among the world's best. The city had money again, even if it wasn't evenly distributed. The 90s gave us Cool Britannia, a rebranding exercise that tried to present London as young, creative, and modern. Tony Blair came to power in 1997, and suddenly politicians were hanging out with Noel Gallagher and going to gallery openings. The young British artists, led by Damien Hirst, made London the centre of the art world. The Tate Modern opened in 2000 in a converted power station on the South Bank, and it was genuinely brilliant, proving that London could do cultural transformation properly. But let's talk about the Millennium Dome, because nothing sums up 90s London quite like that spectacular disaster. Built in Greenwich at enormous cost, it was meant to showcase Britain's achievements as the 20th century ended. Instead, it became a laughingstock almost immediately. The content was confused, the visitor numbers were disappointing, and it hemorrhaged money. It stood empty for years afterwards, a giant white elephant that became shorthand for government waste. That it eventually became the O2 Arena and actually successful doesn't erase the original debacle. Property prices continued their relentless climb. Areas like Shoreditch, which had been semi-industrial and slightly dangerous, became trendy. Old warehouses turned into lofts. The dot-com boom brought new money and new industries. Suddenly everyone was starting internet companies, most of which would collapse spectacularly when the bubble burst in 2000, but not before transforming another chunk of East London. Transport got serious investment. The Jubilee Line extension opened properly in 1999, connecting Docklands to central London and featuring some stunning architecture at stations like Canary Wharf and Westminster. The Eurostar terminal at Waterloo opened in 1994, putting Paris just 3 hours away and making London feel more European than it ever had. The congestion charge was proposed, though it wouldn't be implemented until 2003. The idea that you'd have to pay to drive in central London was controversial, but traffic had become genuinely unbearable. Something had to change. Multiculturalism became the official narrative. London was diverse and proud of it, or at least the official story said so. The reality was more complicated, with some communities feeling marginalised despite the cheerful rhetoric. But undeniably, London was one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities, with over 300 languages spoken within its boundaries. The 2000s began with optimism and ended with financial crisis, with terrorism and triumph mixed in between. The September 11th attacks in 2001 changed security permanently. London's own terrorist attacks on July 7th, 2005, killed 52 people and reminded everyone that the city wasn't immune. The sight of blown-up tube trains and buses was horrific, but the city's response, that famous keep calm determination, was genuinely moving. But 2005 also brought incredible joy when London won the Olympic bid. Beating Paris felt particularly sweet, and suddenly East London had a purpose. The Olympic Park would transform Stratford, an area most Londoners had no reason to visit, into something approaching international standards. The Olympics themselves in 2012 were, against many predictions, actually brilliant. Danny Boyle's opening ceremony celebrated the NHS, the Industrial Revolution, and British eccentricity in equal measure. For a few weeks, London felt genuinely united and optimistic. The financial crisis of 2008 hit London hard. The City of London, which had become so dominant in the 80s, nearly collapsed. Banks were bailed out with public money. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and suddenly all those confident predictions about eternal growth looked rather foolish. Austerity would follow, and the effects are still being felt today. The congestion charge had started in 2003, and despite initial scepticism, it actually worked. Traffic in central London reduced significantly. Ken Livingstone, who had become mayor when the role was created in 2000, pushed through changes that made the city more livable for those who didn't drive. Boris Johnson, who succeeded him in 2008, continued many of the same policies while claiming to be completely different. The Shard began construction in 2009, and Londoners watched as the skyline they'd known for centuries changed dramatically. For the first time since the 1960s, genuine skyscrapers were being built in central London, not just Canary Wharf. The financial district was expanding upward and outward, creating a cluster of towers that earned the collective nickname of architectural vegetables, the gherkin, the walkie-talkie, the cheese grater. Gentrification accelerated to levels that seemed almost parodic. Hackney went from rough to trendy so fast that long-time residents were priced out within a decade. Coffee shops and vintage stores replaced traditional businesses. The word hipster entered common usage, usually as an insult. East London became almost unaffordable, which seemed impossible for those who remembered it in the 70s and 80s. The 2010s were defined by contradictions. On one hand, London was booming, attracting international investment and talent like never before. On the other, austerity was cutting services to the bone. Libraries closed, youth centres shut down, and local councils struggled with impossible budgets. The gap between rich and poor became a chasm. Property values reached levels that would have seemed like satire if they weren't real. Average house prices in London exceeded £500,000. In many areas, they were well over £1 million. An entire generation found themselves priced out of home ownership, leading to the rise of generation rent. People in their 30s and 40s were still flat-sharing, unable to save deposits while paying exorbitant rents. The luxury property boom was particularly controversial. Entire developments were marketed exclusively to foreign buyers, often purchased as investments and left empty. Lights Out London became a real phenomenon, with blocks of flats in prime locations sitting dark because nobody actually lived there. Meanwhile, rough sleeping increased dramatically. The sight of people sleeping in doorways and underpasses became depressingly normal. Brexit dominated the second half of the decade. London voted heavily to remain in the EU, but the country voted to leave. The city felt disconnected from the rest of Britain in a way it never had before. The economy wobbled, uncertainty reigned, and planning became impossible. Years of negotiations followed, and the final outcome satisfied almost nobody. Culturally, London remained vibrant. Grime music went mainstream, with artists like Stormzy achieving commercial success while staying true to their roots. The London theatre scene thrived, museums remained world-class and free, and the restaurant scene exploded with quality and diversity that previous decades couldn't have imagined. Transport continued expanding. Crossrail, eventually named the Elizabeth Line, was under construction, though delays and cost overruns became legendary. Night tube services started on some lines, reflecting London's 24-hour economy. Uber arrived and disrupted the taxi trade, leading to protests and regulatory battles. The Grenfell Tower fire in 2017 was the decade's darkest moment. 72 people died in a preventable disaster that exposed institutional failures and inequality in the starkest terms. The tower, in one of London's richest boroughs, had been refurbished with flammable cladding to save money. The aftermath revealed how little had been learned from past disasters and how expendable some communities were considered. The 2020s began with the pandemic, and London changed overnight. The tube became empty, streets were deserted, and a city built on crowding and interaction ground to a halt. Working from home became standard, and suddenly all those predictions about offices becoming obsolete seemed prescient. Entire industries collapsed. Theatres went dark. Restaurants closed. The city that never stopped had stopped. But Londoners adapted, as they always do. Parks became essential. Neighbourhood communities strengthened, and people rediscovered their local areas. When restrictions lifted, there was genuine joy at returning to normal, though normal had shifted. Hybrid working remained common. Office occupancy never fully recovered, and transport patterns changed permanently. The 2020s have seen London grapple with its identity once again. The Elizabeth line finally opened in 2022, and despite all the delays and cost overruns, it's genuinely transformative. Journey times across London have been slashed, and suddenly places like Reading and Abbey Wood feel properly connected to central London. It's the biggest infrastructure project in decades, and remarkably, it actually works brilliantly. The ultra-low emission zone expanded, making most of Greater London subject to charges for older polluting vehicles. This proved intensely controversial, with protests and legal challenges, but air quality has genuinely improved. London is cleaner than it's been in centuries, though you'd struggle to convince everyone of that. The cost of living crisis has hit London particularly hard. Energy bills soared, food prices increased dramatically, and even middle-class families found themselves struggling. Food banks, once rare, became common. The contradictions of London, always present, became impossible to ignore. Billionaires' Row in Kensington exists in the same city as families choosing between heating and eating. Yet London remains one of the world's great cities. Its diversity is genuine and deep. Its culture is world-leading, and its ability to reinvent itself remains remarkable. The 2020s aren't finished yet, and where London goes next is anyone's guess. Climate change, technology, demographics, and politics will all play their part in shaping the next chapters. From smoke-choked ruins to gleaming, maddeningly expensive metropolis, London's transformations seem almost impossible. Each decade brought disasters and triumphs, leaving a city bombed, rebuilt, and reimagined so often that continuity itself seems remarkable. London never stays still. It's exhausting, exciting, and fascinating in equal measure. If you found this journey through London's decades interesting, hit subscribe and ring the bell for more of Britain's hidden histories. Thanks for watching.